Meanwhile, Ukraine says its troops have advanced further into Russian territory, up to 2 kilometers in the Kursk region since early today. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says his government has discussed setting up a military administration in Kursk to allow the evacuation of civilians. Interior Minister Ihor Klimenko wrote on Telegram that Kyiv is creating a buffer zone to protect its border communities from shelling. Ukraine's military has imposed movement restrictions in the Sumy region, which borders Kursk. And military authorities say this is because of intense fighting in the area and the growing presence of Russian reconnaissance and sabotage units. Our correspondent Nick Connolly is in Sumy, 30 kilometres from the Russian border, and that's where the incursion into Russia was launched from. I asked him to give us a sense of the feel of the city right now.
Well, Sumy might seem like a very ordinary town. Lots of people out on a pretty warm summer's evening on their bikes, going for a walk, going for dinner. But certainly this is now pretty much a frontline city. You have lots of military hardware on the streets. You see lots of cars with that triangle symbol that we've seen on Ukrainian military vehicles going into Russia. Pretty much, every night here they are used to having attacks from the Russian side. Well, certainly we heard what sounded like a ballistic missile coming in last night, and lots of helicopters and planes and drones in the skies. That was very much easily audible. For now, Sumy hasn't been hit more than was the norm over the last 2 years, but certainly those villages near the front lines, near the border that is, are seeing a real intensification of fighting. We were speaking to our evacuees today who were talking about the Russians using a lot of glide bombs, and whereas previously they'd got used to artillery and drones and kind of managed to build a life that allowed them to stay safe, that just isn't the case anymore with those glide bombs being used, with Russia bringing in planes that were previously believed to have been in other places on the front lines, and so they've chosen to leave, and they were now here in Sumy deciding whether to stay or to continue their journey further away from the border.
Yeah, tell us more about your conversations with those people being evacuated from border villages.
So there was a real kind of variety of thoughts. Obviously, there was the kind of most acute logistical questions about where they were going to live, what property they will take with them, what to do about animals that had been left behind, let alone older relatives who refused to leave, either because they were physically not able to move or because they just didn't want to give up their homes. Then there were the people who were saying that maybe this is a good thing, that it actually will show Russian civilians who'd been basically watching the Russian army attack Ukraine for more than 2 years, that it would force them to kind of recognize quite how dangerous war is, and they would maybe put pressure on their own government to end this war. There was that point of view. There are others who were less sure that ordinary Russians, many of whom they might have known before the war, relatives, friends, contacts across the border, they weren't so sure that they would actually change anything, but at least there would be some kind of fairness, that after a time where only people on this side of the border had been suffering, that now the Russians would have to deal with the same. And there was just a hope from lots of them that this buffer zone, as we've heard Ukrainian officials talk about it, would actually just mean that the fighting moves further away from them, and that potentially in a week or two they could go back to their homes and have some kind of normalcy return to those villages.
And are we any clearer on what Ukraine is trying to achieve with these incursions?
Not much. I think the whole point of this is to take the lessons, to draw the lessons of last year's counteroffensive, where there was a lot of trailing, a lot of speculation from top officials in Kiev, and then less in the way of results. This time they're saying little, leaving the space open to change their aims as they go along, basically see how much they can get and how strong the Russian response will be. As for the kind of talk of a buffer zone, it has to be said, this isn't about annexing territory like Russia has in Ukraine, where Russia claims now that whole chunks of Ukraine belong to Russia. This is very clear. They've said this would only be as an exchange, as a kind of bargaining chip to then hand back to the Russians in return for Russia-occupied Ukraine. But for now, I think that there's a sense here that this is going better than people might have expected, and that those famous Russian red lines actually proved to not stand for much.
Okay, thanks for that, Nick. Nick Connolly in Sumy, 30 kilometres from the Russian border.
Let's now speak to Kira Rudik. She's a member of the Ukrainian parliament and leader of the opposition Holos Party. Kira, good to see you again. I understand that you've been to Sumy since the incursion into Russia was launched from there. What was that like?
Hello, Nicole, and thank you so much for having me. Well, people are really motivated by the recent operation by our military forces. And the main motivation is not revenge, but actually having hope that at some point constant shelling from Russia's territory, constant attacks, constant launch of the missile will stop. And this is what the main goal of this operation is, to make sure we distract Russia from attacking us to defending themselves, and that we will be able to destroy military targets on their territories where they were launching attacks on us from. This is key.
Some critics are saying that Ukrainian soldiers are needed to defend fronts within Ukraine, though. What would you say to those that believe Ukraine can't afford to fight inside Russia as well?
I think it's undeniable that our military commandment has been brilliant in conducting the operations that would save our lives, and also be an answer to Russia's attack, and it will be an asymmetrical answer. This is how we stopped Russia from taking Kiev in 3 days that they promised, and conquering the major part of Ukraine that they had hoped to do it by asymmetric steps. And this step is one of those. It is helping to pull Russian troops away from the areas where they planned to for another offensive, and right now it seems to work. So I'm not questioning any of the military decision right now, and I think most of the international military commandments are applauding to the step.
Mm-hmm. You claimed on X in a post that the incursion proves that Russia is vulnerable and weak. That's a look Vladimir Putin doesn't like at all. You know that, I know that. How concerned are you about what he might do to prove Ukraine wrong?
Well, you know, Russia has been threatening us since the day one. They committed all kinds of the war crimes on our territories, and you have seen what they have done to our prisoners of war. So it's actually not the threat that we are afraid, but we are afraid that the war would continue the way it was, and that these attacks will continue. We totally understand that our only way is to show Russia's strengths and make them to pull away from our territories. This is the only way forward, and right now this way seems to be working. There is nothing else that Russia can do to us other than what are they already doing to us. They have destroyed the majority of our energy systems, so these are the rare days when we're having electricity 24 hours a day. They are constantly killing our civilians, including the recent attack on the children's hospital in the center of Kyiv. You know, on a personal note, there was an attack in January when I was at home, and I have witnessed the windows in my home being pulled out of the frames and thrown at me, where I was mildly injured and my neighbors were severely injured. So this is just constant horror that continues, and we need to put a stop to that.
Yeah, I remember we spoke on that day. There is some concern about what Ukraine's end game here is, though. The Ukrainian government says it doesn't seek to hold on to Russian territory seized in this operation. What do you think should be the objective for the territory that is now claimed by Ukraine?
You know, even if the main objective was to push Russian forces away from our border, so good people of Sumy and the border regions would not be suffering from artillery hits, that would already be an achievement for us. That would already save many lives. But I would leave the strategic goals to our military commandment, and I think you would agree that the part of the success of this operation was that there was a really limited amount of people who knew about it beforehand. And it was a surprise for many of us, and also it was a surprise for Russians. So let's hold on to that and hope that our military commandment will have more surprises that are good for our people and bad for the aggressors that are coming here to kill us.
As Ukrainian lawmaker Kira Rudik, thank you for your time.
The governor of Russia's border region of Belgorod has declared a state of emergency due to continued bombardment by Ukrainian forces. Belgorod is next to the Kursk region, where Ukraine's surprise offensive is in its second week. Ukraine's military chief says his forces now control 74 settlements on the Russian territory. More than 120,000 people have been evacuated in the area following Ukraine's advance. For more now, we're joined by our correspondent Janina Semenova in Riga, where our Moscow team relocated after Russia shut them down. Tell us, what more do you know about the situation in Belgorod? Because it's been difficult to get clear information from there.
Yes, that is definitely true. We very much rely on information from state authorities. What Russia is saying now in general is that it has downed more than 110 Ukrainian drones overnight in several Russian regions, some deeper into Russian territory. But among those is also the Belgorod region you mentioned, and their regional authorities have declared a regional emergency in the Belgorod region, making it the second region after Kursk to have this state since Ukraine's incursion started last week. And regional authorities claim there is daily shelling, there are destroyed houses, and also that civilians have been killed. We hear of people being evacuated. We've seen the images in Belgorod. There is, for example, one district, the Krasnoyarsky district, that apparently has no residents left there anymore. And this comes, of course, of this larger scale of invasion that has been going on since Ukraine started this incursion last week. And this really makes us see the scale of the incursion, from Ukraine's side. Ukraine now says it's advancing even further, and Russian commanders say, pretty much making this image of that the situation is under control. They say the front in Kursk has stabilized.
Right.
But of course that is kind of difficult to assess for us. What makes this what kind of contradicts this is that Russia is pulling troops, allegedly now, according to Lithuania's defense minister, from its exclave in Kaliningrad to Kursk. So not really a sense of control in this region.
Now, Ukraine has offered to stop its raids if Moscow agreed to what Ukraine calls a just peace. What's the Kremlin's position on this, Janina?
Yes, Vladimir Putin has now said that with this incursion, Ukraine wants to improve its position, its negotiation position for possible peace talks. But Putin has also said that there's nothing to talk about. He won't negotiate with someone who kills civilians and destroys civilian infrastructure. At least that's what Putin claims. But of course, we have to remember here who launched this war, who launched this full-scale invasion more than 2 years ago now. And of course, that was Russia.
Right.
And Russia has always said that it wants to end this war with a victory. But of course, this victory for Russia means not giving back the territory that it has annexed in eastern Ukraine. So, of course, it doesn't really look like Russia is looking for peace there.
Janina, thank you very much. That was DW's Janina Semenova in Riga.